welcome to the show tonight. And this is going to be like a blast from the past because tonight you aren't going to see me on screen. So that means I can sit here in my pajamas and do my nails or just, pet Mufasa, do whatever. But it is going to be like the old days, which I loved doing my show without video, even though there are some fun advantages to it. But at my guest's request tonight, he said that we should do it that way and that there's something very powerful in the voice, and I totally agree. You can hear my voice, focus on some of the things that we're going to say, and I know tonight is going to be a wonderful night. I'm looking forward to it. So, as we know, I have had a constant theme as of late, and that is trying to expose truth. When you go down rabbit holes in the conspiracy genre or the UFO world, you get thrown a lot of things that, well, basically are not the truth. And it can have some devastating consequences on not only ourselves, but family members and the community. So subtle or not so subtle, the things we're exposed to on a daily basis shape how we interact with our friends, family, society, and unfortunately, in recent years, there's been an increasing interest in the consequences of conspiracy theories, and COVID-19, when that hit, that just did a number, as we all know, on our mental health. And you can bet that people that were grifting in the UFO world, crypto lords, political and religious figures took advantage of our fear and our anxiety to line their pockets and to shape the world in, unfortunately, a very unpleasant place right now. If you do a little research and go out there, you can go to the Spanish Journal of Psychology. There's an article written by Karen Douglas, Are Conspiracy Theories Harmless? It goes to, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It was published online by Cambridge University Press. And she says that she'll outline what we know about the consequences of conspiracy theories for individuals, groups, and societies, arguing that they are certainly not harmless. In particular, research suggests that conspiracy theories are associated with political apathy, support for non-normative political action, climate denial, vaccine refusal, prejudice, crime, violence, disengagement in the workplace, and reluctance to adhere to COVID-19 recommendations. In her article, she discusses the challenges of dealing with negative consequences of conspiracy theories, and she also talks about opportunities for future research. You can also go to an article that is entitled, This Will Change Your Life, Why the Grandiose Promises of Multi-Level Marketing and QAnon Conspiracies Go Hand in Hand. And that is written by Caitlin Tiffany, and I will provide links in the show notes for all of these articles. And then, of course, from the Daily Beast, Trumpland, QAnon leaders push followers into multi-level marketing. And I'm going to read just a little bit of this. This was published on April 15th, 2022. And it says, MLMs, which rely on new members recruiting subordinate salespeople with the original upline making money from their downline recruit sales, have previously been the domain of leggings and essential oils companies. But now QAnon leaders want in on the action. As you've heard me talk about before on UFO Classified and now on Expanding Frontiers, I mentioned a conference that I went to up in Vernal, Utah, and how most of the speakers at that conference were promoting crypto. And isn't it interesting that when you look at Avi Loeb and some of these other figures who have, made pretty prominent headlines, you see that, yes, they're pushing crypto. Why is that? Does it really have anything to do with UFOs or furthering research? Not so much. But anyway, I'm excited to delve into that. The next few weeks are going to be very exciting. You can go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to look at the brilliant work that both Barry Greenwood and Jack Brewer do on a consistent basis. And I'm looking forward to doing a combined interview with both of them coming up. But my guest tonight is the author of one of my favorite books, CHAMELEO. He's been on UFO Classified before, and CHAMELEO really was a mind-blowing book for me, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. He is also, his latest book is called Operation Mindfuck, QAnon and the Cult of Donald Trump. And this is really mind-blowing, and I suggest that you go to his website, CRYPTOSCATOLOGY.com, to get the book. You can get a 20% discount. Add that to your list and read it. And if you have differing opinions, then please come back to my show and let's talk about them, because I know that this is a hot button issue. We all have different ideas, and I think the great thing about this show is we can present those ideas, talk through them, and hopefully move forward in a positive direction. My guest this evening, Robert Guffey, is a lecturer in the Department of English at California State University, Long Beach. His most recent books are Wonderland Award-nominated collection, The Widow of the Amputation and Other Weird Crimes. I just love his titles. And I'm going to add Robert to the show. Welcome, Robert. But I just, like, every time I read your titles and see your covers, I'm totally blown away. And then you also, the Rondo Award-nominated novel, BELA LUGOSI'S DEAD. And then you've got the one that I just mentioned, Operation Mindfuck, QANON, and the Cult of Donald Trump, which is described as jaw-dropping and essential. And then Until the Last Dog Dies, which was written in 2017. And, like I mentioned, CHAMELEO, a strange but true story of invisible spies, heroin addiction, and homeland security. And that one really blows my mind. And so I'm really happy to have you here. And I also want to mention that you write for Salon, and you can see some of the great articles there about QAnon. And so welcome to the show, Robert. It's nice to have you.
I thank you for having me back on.
Yeah, and it's so much fun to just focus on doing like the radio aspect of things. So thank you.
Well, radio will always be better than television.
That is, like, we're saying, like, radio and television. God, we're so old school.
Yes, well, the words change, but the concepts remain the same.
Exactly. And there, like, seriously is something to be said, though, for just listening to somebody's voice and the cadence, and just, it's really cool and a very powerful thing. And I think that's why, obviously, podcasts are such, they're so popular all over.
Well, one of the odd and unexpected side effects of the internet is the retrieval of old-time radio. I mean, essentially, you have all these podcasts, like very popular podcasts, like Welcome to Night Vale, which is a very odd mixture of sort of like Twin Peaks and H.P. Lovecraft and the Twilight Zone, but kind of refashioned for the 21st century. And are you familiar with that podcast, Welcome to Night Vale?
No.
It's wonderful. It's pure fiction, but it purports to be an actual. You're listening to a radio broadcast out of this little town in the desert called Night Vale, and there's all these bizarre paranormal activity going on, but the people in the town don't seem to find it particularly odd. And you're listening in on the radio broadcast every night as these odd paranormal phenomena are being reported. And then there's a nearby town called Desert Bluffs, which is sort of like the daylit version of Night Vale, where all the normal people live and nothing unusual ever happens there. And the two towns hate each other. And the mythology expands over the course of many different episodes. My daughter, who's 14, she loves that. But it's essentially it's like old time radio. It's like Lights Out or Suspense, from the 1930s.
Wow.
I mean, Marshall McLuhan, who wrote Understanding Media, he talked about how technology, the new technology, also always takes the old technology and absorbs it. So that's why at the beginning of television, many of the early television shows were essentially radio shows. Jack Benny and Lone Ranger, these things were very popular on the radio. So when television starts, they adapted all those to television. And the content of the new media is always the old media. So it's always fascinating to see how the new technology reaches into the past and pulls out elements and then reconfigures it. So that is one of the odd, unexpected side effects of the internet, is the retrieval of old-time radio drama, essentially.
And you know what? It took so much talent, and I mean, I just remember like even watching some of the old movies, back in the day. It's like it left things to the imagination. And that's one thing about radio. It's like, you're hearing sound effects and you're hearing people talk, and there's so much you create with your mind. And I think that's a very powerful thing, and we've almost become lazy in a sense.
Well, it's interesting. I'm working right now on a book that I've been working on for quite a long time, off and on, called Hollywood Haunts the World. And it's a analysis of film from 1921 to 2021, so it covers 100 years. It's pretty much done. But in there, I'm fascinated by how uh, film. I often tell my creative writing students, if you want to, there's an old saw, and that is, if you want to find a new idea, read a very old book. And the same is true with, if you want to write screenplays, if you write short stories or novels. I tell my students, you don't want to all be reading the same exact things, because some of them come in with the prejudice that if something was made like more than 15 seconds ago, it's not hip, and you shouldn't be reading it.
Wow.
And I try to instill in them, look, if you're all being influenced by the same exact things, all your writing is going to look exactly the same. You want to stand out from the crowd. So if you go back, if you want to write a screenplay, you want to direct a film, you go back and you look at silent films, you'll find techniques there that will seem brand new to people because they fell to the wayside, and people don't use those techniques. I have a friend, Jack Womack, who's a brilliant novelist, lives in New York. He wrote Random Acts of Senseless Violence, Let's Put the Future Behind Us, and a lot of other brilliant novels. And he has written a series of books that take place in a near future version of New York that's very dystopian. And I was with him in a bookstore, which used to be the greatest bookstore in the world, Acres of Books in Long Beach, which is sadly no longer there. Huge used bookstore, and I found amazing old UFO books at Acres of Books. Their occult UFO section was in the corner of the room, right next to where they kept the kitty litter box. I don't know if that was like that was their like criticism of it, or if it was just a coincidence. I
Yeah,
don't
that's
know.
a
But
cool thing, I think.
you had to step over the kitty litter box to get to the UFO section, and it
Walk the
always smelled.
gauntlet.
It always smelled like cat pee. But I found dozens and dozens of wonderful old UFO books in that section, and so I took Jack Womack there, who's a bit of a rare book bibliophile, and while I was there, he found an old copy of Gangs of New York, the original like first edition hardcover of Gangs of New York, which was later made into a film,
Right.
of course, by Coppola. And Jack Womack handed me the book, and he said, "You have to read this book." I had never read it. The original book is not fiction; it's nonfiction, and it's the study of what New York was like way back in the 1800s. And and when I read the book, I realized I called up Jack and I said, I realized that his vision of the future of New York was based on the vision of what New York used to be like in hundreds of years ago. And I asked him, I go, did you take your vision of the future was based on the vision of the past? And he said, yes, absolutely. That was his inspiration. But you would never know that unless, he actually put the book in my hand and told me to read it. You never would have guessed that. I mean, if you read Random Acts of Senseless Violence, it reads like this prescient, very prescient. It was published in '95, but if you read it now, it seems extremely prescient in terms of what's going on now with Trump and everything else. So I think it's fascinating that if you're really interested and you want to stand out from the crowd, the way to do that, if you're trying to establish yourself in any creative medium, would be to not ignore the technology and the books and the stories and the radio shows of the past, but to go back and actually delve into that stuff and really study it closely. You can get inspired in strange ways. I was recently listening to Orson Welles' versions of The Shadow, the Shadow radio show from the 1930s. And Orson Welles had developed this technique on the stage and in radio, which was this kind of crosstalk technique. Before that point in theater, actors generally, one actor would say something, then the other actor will respond. Then the other actor says something, then the other actor responds. Orson Welles developed this technique of crosstalk where actors were talking over each other, which mimics what happens in real life. In real life, when you're talking, two people, they talk over each other, you finish the other person's sentences, a bunch of people are talking at the same time. If you watch Citizen Kane and Touch of Evil, and a lot of his other films, you'll see him using that technique. Well, I was listening to The Shadow, these early episodes from the 1930s, where Agnes Moorehead, who worked with Orson Welles in Mercury Theater, plays Margot Lane, the Shadow's sidekick and companion, and Orson Welles is Lamont Cranston, the Shadow. And I could tell that he was using that cross technique whenever those two characters would speak. But then whenever any other character came on, it was clear that they weren't using that kind of cross-talking technique. It was almost like Orson Welles was directing a mini drama within the drama. And I began to think about how you would, how one presents dialogue on the printed page. And it actually sort of inspired me to experiment with how to apply that kind of technique to prose. So you can, by looking at the old media, you can actually figure out how to take elements of that and, like in alchemy, turn it into something brand new.
You've totally inspired me. I know what I'm going to geek out on all weekend because that is, I mean, that is so true. It's just, and Orson Welles was such a master of that. And that, God, fascinating. Okay, thank you. I am re-inspired. Thank you, thank you.
My friend, Gary Rhodes, who's the head of the film department in Oklahoma, and he was previously the head of the film department in Florida and in university in Ireland as well. He's taught all over the world. I wrote a book with him called Bela Lugosi and the Monogram 9, which is a study of the films that Bela Lugosi made on Poverty Row in the 1940s. And Gary was telling me that he tells his students the same thing. He teaches screenwriting classes and filmmaking classes, and he'll tell his graduate students, yeah, you really need to go back and look at these silent films or the films of the 30s and 40s. It's interesting, particularly in the book I'm writing, Hollywood Haunts the World. Very often you're watching films that were made under very strict rules and conditions where you had heavy censorship issues. I mean, there were a whole long list of things that you could not do or portray in these early films. And it's interesting to watch them to see how the filmmakers would get around those things. How they would tackle sensitive subjects in ways that were encoded or heavily veiled by metaphor or symbolism. And somehow, sometimes, and generally, obviously I, as any artist would be against censorship. Nonetheless, sometimes those kind of restrictions in a weird way free you up and force you to think of different ways to present an idea. So it's always fascinating to watch those films of the 30s to see how they get around the censorship. And it's not like the problem of censorship has gone away. You can also use the techniques that they used, and then think about it in terms of today, where if there's any sort of taboo topic that you're trying to wrestle with in a work of art or a movie or a television show, and see how did they deal with it? How did they get around the censorship? The book I'm writing, Hollywood Haunts the World, is specifically dealing with taboos and how taboos were dealt with specifically in the medium of film from 1921 all the way to 2021. And I analyzed this pattern of how there were certain topics, taboo topics, that you would see encoded, usually often in genre films, but not always. For example, the first chapter is all about, or rather the second chapter is all about what I call evolutionary horror films of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And at the time, you could not teach the theory of evolution. You could not teach Darwin in many schools in the United States. So you certainly couldn't talk about it in film, but you saw a slew of horror/science fiction films that would deal with the Darwin and the theory of evolution, but they would do it in this encoded metaphorical way. So I analyzed all the films from going back to the 20s. Lon Chaney Sr. did films like this, going all the way forward in the 30s with the Bela Lugosi movies, Boris Karloff, mad scientist films where women are turning into apes, apes are turning into women, men are turning into apes, women are mating with apes, all kinds of
Oh,
different
Hail
bizarre,
Mary.
bizarre fantastical, metaphorical ways of exploring Darwin in a way to get around the religious strictures of the day. And eventually what you see, and I follow this pattern in many of the chapters, eventually the whatever the taboo topic is becomes absorbed by the mainstream and it just becomes accepted. And then there's no longer a need to encode it in metaphor anymore. And then usually it will be dealt with in an almost semi-documentary way. And I have a whole chapter, it's the longest chapter in the book, dealing with the JFK assassination, is seen entirely just through film.
Mm-hmm.
And how you see the JFK assassination, how it's dealt with, first in metaphor, first then later encoded in political thrillers like the Parallax View in the 70s, and then eventually it just dealt with nakedly. Oliver Stone made JFK, and
Mm-hmm.
it just deals with it, in an almost semi-documentary way. But before that, you only saw it dealt with in terms of like science fiction or paranoid thrillers. And there's there's a whole chapter about UFOs, and I analyze the Man from Planet X, the very first alien invasion film. I analyze that at great length. Anyway, that book is almost done, and will probably publish sometime maybe this year or next year.
Okay, so then you're coming back again. Because that is absolutely fascinating, and just to hear the evolution and the way that it transforms, its societies in very subtle ways.
Oh, absolutely, and that's another topic that I explore in the book, is to what extent is Ezra Pound said that the poet is the antennae of the race, meaning that the poet expresses things before anyone else, and that would go for any artist as well, a musician, filmmaker. And so you see how I think there's almost two strains that you can identify in art, or if you want to examine just film in particular. There's sort of the guerrilla filmmaking technique, guerrilla, Guerilla, in terms of using film to express revolutionary ideas, pushing forward progressive ideas. Then there's also a strain of filmmaking, particularly in genre films and horror films, where there's also a reactionary kind of horror film. So there's you'll find like the progressive horror film that's trying to push things forward and push the envelope, and then there's also a different type of reactionary horror film that uses the horror tropes to reinforce fear and try to it's very neophobic. There's a fear of the new, and this, oddly enough, I think actually ties into QAnon in a weird way, because QAnon is a horror story. It
Right.
is at its core
Right.
almost a participatory horror story, but it uses and borrows horror tropes going back 100 years or more, and actually just actively steals and plunders elements of pulp fiction going back to the 1940s and the 30s, and even elements of just cheapjack horror films from the late 50s, early 60s. There's a little known film called The Leech Woman, directed by a guy named Edward Dean, Dein,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a Universal film, just this obscure black and white film, which revolves around an expedition of these American white explorers who come across this remote village in this region of Africa where members of the tribe are held down and they're drugged during this ritualistic ceremony in which the pineal gland fluids are extracted from their still living bodies. And the pineal gland fluid is then given to the leech woman who consumes the liquid and grows decades younger. But then she has to keep sacrificing people in order to maintain this veneer of youth. And she goes on this killing spree in Los Angeles. But you can see
Oh,
elements of this in the whole adrenochrome
wow.
aspect of QAnon, where supposedly, Democrats, liberal Democrats, and members of the Illuminati are kidnapping children, taking them underground, extracting pineal gland fluids from their still living bodies, and then drinking the adrenochrome, and it's making them young, right? And
Right.
that's why Tom Hanks looks exactly like he did when he was 20, right?
Well, I mean, not really
Uh,
so much, but that's what they say.
and I even I saw a report on QAnon, and it was some actually like mainstream network had done some segment on it, and there was a bunch of QAnon people who were protesting something. I can't remember what the hell it was. Maybe it was Tom Hanks. In fact, I think it was. And one of the QAnon protesters was holding up this massive sign that he had made with Tom Hanks' face in the middle of it and like red threads going from there to every other single element in the QAnon universe, like some madman.
Okay.
So like one of those crime maps you see in like a police detective show. And the reporter comes up to the guy, is like, what exactly are you accusing Tom Hanks of? And the QAnon guy's like, Tom Hanks is kidnapping children and extracting the adrenochrome, and he and all these other Lady Gaga and all these other stars are doing the same thing. And then the news reporter goes, can you prove that that's happening? And then the guy goes, can you prove it's not happening? Which
Oh,
is
I
like
think I know
classic.
exactly what you're talking about. I think I watched that last night again because I was going through, different interviews with QAnon supporters. And yep, you're right.
Well, I mean, it's like classic logic 101. I mean, it's like the most basic logical fallacy. You can't prove a negative. Can you prove it's not happening? Um, I mean, and then you think about this person. This person went out of their way. They could have been doing a million other things. Instead, they built this giant sign and went outside the hotel where Tom Hanks was, and he and a bunch of other QAnon people were there, wasting their time on this. And I think about the cleverness of the QAnon narrative, because you have to kind of you have to give them kudos for thinking this up, implementing it, and having it be as successful as it has been. And you think, imagine the engineers, the people who were conscripted to create this mythos, and I use the word mythos on purpose to mirror H.P. Lovecraft's the Cthulhu mythos, because there's definitely Lovecraftian elements in the QAnon narrative. They were conscripted to sit down, think up this whole QAnon mythos, and sell it to everybody. Imagine if that type of cleverness, that type of attention to detail, was taken up by creating a mythos that actually brought people together. you know,
I mean, wow, wouldn't that be nice? But yeah, obviously, clearly, that's not coming together for
well,
us.
I guess there's no money in that. But imagine that. Imagine all the time and energy and psychic energy that was poured into this operation. Imagine that same attention to detail, like being brought to creating a kind of a new mythology that would bring people together and work towards a better future. Ray Bradbury wrote a story called The Toynbee Vector that's kind of about this, because it's about a guy who makes up an elaborate lie. In this case, it's just one person. It's not a group of people, but this one guy creates this elaborate lie that basically encourages the entire human race to like pull together and work towards the future that everyone wants. And the man who did this is now an old man, and there's this news reporter who discovers that this whole thing that inspired everybody was a lie. But at the end of the day, I think the reporter decides not to even talk about it because, it all ended up okay in the end, right? And so you can see Bradbury is using this as a metaphor for, the purpose of fiction. A lot of people read Martian Chronicles when they were kids and they went into the space program. You know, Bradbury is a type of guy who's using myth as and quote lies unquote fiction as a positive, a reinforcing force. And unfortunately, there's a whole lot of people who could be using their talents in that direction, and instead they choose to divide people. And I'm sure that the people who, the QAnon architects, are kind of surprised at how successful it's been. There's an article that was in Business Insider on January 8th, so just a few days ago, and it actually mentions polls, various polls about how many people continue to believe in QAnon. And this is in the context of talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene. Just before we started the show, we were talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and it says in here, this is just a couple of paragraphs. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said in the Sunday TV interview that, like many other Americans, she had gotten sucked into QAnon conspiracy theories that she saw online. She's trying to distance herself from it now.
Yes, she is.
Greene appeared on Fox News Media Buzz on Sunday to discuss the events that unfolded in the House last week as Republicans spent days negotiating to eventually elect Kevin McCarthy of California as Speaker. Now, QAnon is a motivating force in that whole farce that went on there. With McCarthy. Greene noted that many of the 20 Republican holdouts who eventually came around had requested committee assignments before agreeing to back McCarthy, adding that she, on the other hand, was still not on any committees. She hasn't been on any committees since she's entered Congress.
That's okay.
The host, Howard Kurtz, said Democrats stripped Greene of her committees in 2021 because of statements she made about conspiracy theories and her past support of QAnon. Well, like a lot of people today, I had easily gotten sucked into some things I had seen on the internet, Greene said, but that was dealt with quickly, early on. I never campaigned on those things.
What?
That was not something I believed in. That's not what I ran for Congress on. So those are so far in the past. Then it says, it's unclear how many Americans support the QAnon movement, but various polls have suggested the share of Americans who agree with at least some QAnon beliefs is 20%, while one 2021 poll found 30% viewed the movement favorably. Shortly after joining Congress, Greene was removed from committees because of statements she made about violence against lawmakers and conspiracy theories. Greene previously expressed support on her personal Facebook page for assassinating Democrats, including former President Barack Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In an old video that resurfaced at the time, Greene could be seen harassing a survivor of the Parkland school shooting, which she called the false flag
That was
operation.
so disgusting. That was really vile.
Kevin McCarthy, who was the House Minority Leader at the time, said Greene had denounced QAnon and she should not be punished for statements she made before being elected to Congress. But insiders Eliza Relman reported that a month after Greene was elected, she shared a blog post by Andrew Torba, the CEO of Gab, a far-right social networking service, that defended QAnon followers, with Torba saying that he had seen no conspiracy theories shared by the community. A representative for Greene did not immediately respond to insiders' request for comment. I'm sure she didn't. But so in that article, it's saying 30% of Americans view QAnon favorably. That's a lot of people. And we still see it rippling forward, not just in the chaos involving Kevin McCarthy recently, but also in the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband.
Right.
And the attacker was sharing a bunch of QAnon memes and posts on social media. And the MAGA conservatives do what they always do which is whenever something like this happens, they try to flip it so that it's actually, no, it's the Democrats' fault. And the QAnon conspiracy theory run around was that Nancy Pelosi's husband, the guy who attacked him, was actually a male prostitute hired by Pelosi's husband. And then later, that would start with this being shared online. But then when I would tune into like Newsmax, which is, people who watch Newsmax think that Fox News is too liberal. And on Newsmax, they will, it's almost like QAnon adjacent. They will share QAnon stuff, but they won't ever mention QAnon. But they will kind of allude to it so that if you're aware, so whenever they would cover the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, they would kind of subtly allude to the QAnon theory about the male prostitute thing. And QAnon's like all over Newsmax. And when I started publishing the articles on Salon, which were published in, I think, August and September of 2020. Mm-hmm. It was a whole 5-part series. I would receive, I'll call it fan mail from people. And this is an example of one of the pieces of fan mail I got. This is from a guy named Brian. And it says, Sudi, you're disturb you while enjoying adrenochrome. You are all sick mother duckers. You're lower than CNN. Go fuck yourselves. MAGA fucking wiggers. Sent from my iPhone X.
I might know the person that wrote that.
You might.
Interesting.
And then soon after that, I got a message from a guy named Ron. I won't say his last name, if indeed this is his last name. But it says, biggest load of biased cack I've read since the last CNN article I wasted my life reading. Both of them reference CNN for some reason. They're reading CNN more than I'm reading CNN. It says, who the fuck gives a poop about your opinion, apart from and then there was an icon of a sheep, that can't think for themselves. You don't know everything there is to know? Let people think for themselves and come to a design on their own. And I thought, I never said I knew everything there is to know. There's not one point in that Salon series where I said I know everything there is to know, and by the way, here are my opinions on QAnon. And then the last sentence I think is the most revealing. Let people think for themselves. So it's like, how does me publishing a series of informative articles about where QAnon actually comes from, how does that prevent people from thinking for themselves? You see, it's almost he's implying that any point of view that's different from his own is somehow infringing on his freedom of thought. So, see, this is the solipsistic problem that we all find ourselves in today, whether you're on the far right, the far left. This tendency to think that any point of view that deviates from your own and seeing it is somehow preventing you from going about your life. I got another one, and this one's a little more well thought out. This one says, for the dude who wrote CRYPTOSCATOLOGY, which that's my first book. CRYPTOSCATOLOGY is a word I made up. Crypto is Latin for secret. Scatology means the study of shit. So you put it together, it's the study of secret shit. Right?
Love it.
So for the dude who wrote CRYPTOSCATOLOGY, which is a formidable work of philosophy, in my opinion, representing a sea change in the taxonomies of emergent artistic form, the PTSD of the Trump administration sure seems to have driven you into the arms of DNC groupthink conformity. QAnon's acolytes are victims of state abuse. Their good intentions weaponized against them, and they should be pitied for their gullibility and lack of media sophistication. The belief that they represent our national demons, or God forbid, a domestic terror threat, is a divisive tool that distracts from the actual powers that threaten the Bill of Rights, among many other things. Godspeed, and let's get back on track, man. Shit is not normal, and humanity needs your restored, discerning eye. Come on, man. Why don't you admit comments to be posted? You might actually encourage more traffic and maybe even book sales. I don't get it, except to assume the UC administration must keep a close eye on your blog these days. Fuck the Leviathan. I'm the furthest possible thing from a Trump supporter, RNC supporter, or Second Amendment nut, or anything of the sort. But if the day of Epiphany January 6th clown show constitutes a veritable attempt at insurrection, you clearly haven't seen the compilation video of Ashley Babbitt's, quote, murder, unquote. This is clearly a charade staged by law enforcement actors. So then it came with a link to this video about Ashley Babbitt and how she wasn't really murdered, you see. And I encourage people when they get videos like this, I mean, I guess the reasonable thing would just be to ignore it entirely. Right? But if you are going to watch it, first watch it with the sound down and just watch the videos, the images, then go back and watch it with the narration. You'll find that the narration is the thing that is leading you into interpreting the images in the way they want you to interpret it. And this particular video was all about how Ashley Babbitt wasn't murdered. And we know this because the glass broke way too easily. And so that's Hollywood glass. It's like fake glass they use in like breakaway glass that they use in Hollywood. And then they said, oh, in this video, Ashley Babbitt has no blood on her face. But then a second later in this other video, you can tell from the timestamp, it's only a few seconds later, there's blood all coming down out of her nose. This is obviously, this is a Hollywood squib. This is one of those things that they use when they're shooting. I'm thinking, I think the blood's coming from inside her head.
Oh my God.
And not from a squib. Then it shows there's one guy who's has a microphone shoved into his face in the hall after having just seen this woman shot, and the guy goes, "Oh, you know, I saw she got shot in the chest." And then outside, it's a new video with the same guy, and he's like, "Yeah, I was right there. I was standing right there, and they shot her in the head." And then the narrator says, "You see the inconsistency? First he said she got shot." And I'm thinking, yeah, I think if you just saw a woman shot in front of you, you're not really too focused on matters of anatomy. I think he just misspoke.
I mean, and oh my God, that's heartbreaking. I mean, like not this person's interpretation, but just the whole thing. You know, the whole thing that led to this moment where a beautiful person's life was, needlessly, she had, she passed away because of what happened. And the whole thing is, it's a sad thing for so many people.
Well, this is an important moment in Operation Mindfuck. I was monitoring Rick Renee's Blessed to Teach show, which is a far-right evangelical QAnon podcast that had thousands and thousands of followers on YouTube before YouTube dropped it. But he's still on his own platform. And it'd be impossible to monitor every single QAnon, QTuber in existence. So I thought, okay, I'm going to focus on like one or two. So I focused on this Rick Renee guy because I thought he was like the perfect microcosm of the radicalization of the right. I signed up for his email newsletters under the name Edgar Allan Poe, and each newsletter would come to me saying, "Hello, Ed," and then it would go into selling his strange Christian evangelical alternative health items. And he in the first email he sends out whenever you sign up for the newsletter, he gives you his superhero origin story, and he says how he just a few years ago, before Trump was elected, he was just a normal guy working for a tech company, Christian, would go to church every Sunday, play sports with his kids. He goes, and then he said his 17-year-old son started sending him videos, like Alex Jones videos and stuff like that. And he said, at first I was put off by the presentation of these videos. He goes, but then I started listening to the content. I started doing my own research. And then Trump was, elected president, and I was shocked. And then he goes on to say how, now he has this podcast and this QAnon podcast. And so he went within only a few years of being, in his own words, just a normal Texan Christian playing sports with his kids, to now he has a QAnon podcast where he's constantly calling for the destruction of American monuments like the Statue of Liberty and the Washington Monument because they were built by satanic Freemasons, and they have to be destroyed. He's calling for the destruction of the FBI. And when Ashley Babbitt was murdered, I specifically went out of my way to tune into the show to hear what he had to say about that, and it was absolutely incredible. He basically implied that she was some sort of like it was a false flag, uh, or either she wasn't really murdered, or she was an actor working for the deep state and was just done to make the QAnon people look bad. And I thought, this is ironic. The whole QAnon slogan, where we go one, we go all.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, the truth of the matter is that whenever one of these QAnon people decides to take a bullet for the team and they go out and they actually do something violent, they actually go out and do the thing that all these other QAnon people are just talking about, immediately you will be accused by your fellow QAnon brethren of being either non-existent or being a deep state actor, or you're actually a liberal in disguise, or you were never really murdered. Ashley Babbitt actually probably listened to this guy. Like this guy was probably like a hero to her, and she died so that he could go on the air a couple of days later and say she didn't exist, or she wasn't really murdered, or she was actually a member of the deep state. That's what actually happens.
Oh
You
my
don't end up
God.
in Valhalla.
Right. Right.
Instead, you end up getting attacked and accused of being a member of the controlled opposition.
And that is, I mean, that's just mind blowing. And then, of course, when you hear about that, your mind goes to Alex Jones, who is probably one of the most despicable human beings on the planet. And yet he's been given a voice on Coast to Coast AM multiple, years and years. It's that in and of itself is really frightening. And I would love to maybe approach the people at Coast to Coast and ask them for statements about Sandy Hook and all the settlements that Alex Jones has lost and why they would promote somebody like that. But I'm sure they won't say anything. That's the way it rolls.
I heard an interview with Richard Hoagland at a time when Richard Hoagland wasn't going on Coast to Coast. He'd already started his own podcast thing. And he mentioned during that interview that he said that was one of the things that really pissed off Art Bell about what had happened to Coast after he left, is that Art Bell really disliked Alex Jones.
That's interesting.
And there were all these people who were trying to get him to have Alex Jones on in the latter years of Art Bell's show when he was running it. And he refused to have him on. And then when he left, suddenly Alex Jones he's probably been on more than the only other person who's been on more than him is maybe Jerome Corsi, who's another QAnon guy.
Or, well, I mean, yeah, and then you look at, Stuart Rhodes and things like that, and that in and of itself and the Oath Keepers is definitely an interesting road that unfortunately I had to go down in up close and personal. And I can tell you that having lived with a person that was obsessed and a card-carrying member of the Oath Keepers and stockpiling guns and ammunition and working behind the scenes with people in the shadows to do Lord knows what, that was a really an eye-opening and frightening experience. And to sit there and watch this person consume, specific, news channels and things that were just, it was like this programming, and it was just hate, all 24 hours a day. You wake up and you're opening an email and it was how we should hate this person, or how we should despise the Jews, or how we should, A, B, C, and D, create, use military people to overthrow the government when that's, those are your comrades. It was just, it was absolutely mind-blowing.
Oh well, I mean, I remember. I don't know how deeply you want to get into this, but I remember talking to you and Chris Marks for about 2 hours on the phone, and it was not long after my series about QAnon had come out on Salon, and he came across to me as the exact polar opposite of somebody who would be, secretly a member of the Oath Keepers. So when that story came out about, and all those, and not just him, but a lot of people in law enforcement were doxxed, including the sheriff of the Riverside Police Department, turned out to be a member of the Oath Keepers, and he came out and said, "Oh, I don't remember joining, but if I did join, then they're not extremists, but I don't remember joining, but they're not extremists. I don't know who they are, but I know they're not extremists. I don't know how you join and you don't remember joining." And there were, and a lot of other New York police officers were doxxed in the same experience. And I remember it was almost like there was a TV show on starring Kevin Bacon a few years ago called The Following.
Oh, yes.
Where the Kevin Bacon was an FBI guy, right? And he's investigating this dude who manages to create a cult entirely through posts on the internet. And the dude was just this like English professor who was the main antagonist. And he basically turned all these people into conspiracy theories through just interacting with them through posts on the internet. And the show, as it went on, Kevin Bacon would discover that, oh, this fellow FBI agent, he's a part of the cult, and then this guy who's a police officer is part of the cult. I remember watching it at the time thinking, oh man, this is getting too ridiculous. Like, there's no way that a dude on the internet could make all these people into cult followers just through posts on the internet. There's no way that all these like FBI agents in LA, PD officers would just suddenly go towards this like cult figure on the internet. Mm-hmm. Now it seems totally prescient. So I have to give The Following an apology that I thought it was ridiculous, because if anything, it was actually prescient. Particularly when, I mean, there was a good article in Mother Jones back in 2020 called "QAnon is Attracting Cops," and it was all about all the police officers who were just sort of openly flaunting their allegiance to Q. And of course, it says here in the article, some people in power who have been asked to answer for QAnon supporters in their proximity have acted as if the conspiracy is ultimately harmless. But this is a dangerous misconception, especially when it comes to government agents empowered to use force. The logic of the conspiracy theory almost requires its adherents to carry out acts of violence. If you actually believe that elites are harboring scores of children in underground tunnels to rape and steal blood from, taking action to liberate them would be a moral imperative. It reminds me of, for years, hypnotists would say you can't hypnotize someone to do something that would be against their basic like moral strictures, right? But of course, the way around that is that you hypnotize them to think that you're doing something else. Instead you hypnotize them to think, well, you're not killing that person, you're actually liberating them, or they're moving on to a higher plane of existence. That's the way you get around that. So that most of these people probably, if left to their own devices, would not go to the U.S. Capitol and chase police officers up the stairs, right? I mean, and I suspect that a lot of them went to the Capitol with the intent of, having a peaceful protest. I don't think most of them went there thinking I'm going to be involved in an insurrection today. But when I was watching it and listening to the QAnon podcast immediately preceding January 6th, it was amazing to hear people like on the Rick Renee Blessed to Teach show. He had this weird sidekick named Gene Decode, who supposedly was in contact with all these secret intelligence agents who were giving him all this vital information about the Illuminati and the Freemasons pulling kids down into underground bases. And Gene came on, I think it was probably January 3rd, so maybe like 3 days before the 6th. And he came on, he said, listen, and I quote him directly in the book, listen, if you see tanks coming down the street and the military is taking over, don't go for your guns. Let them do that. They need to do that. The military is the only way. That became one of the major QAnon slogans. The military is the only way to solve this problem of liberal Democrats stealing your children. It seems clear to me that one of the early imperatives of the whole Q project was, how do we deal with all these sort of libertarian types with guns who, for the past several decades, have been extremely paranoid about the idea of military camps being built on U.S. soil and people being rounded up by the military, thrown in concentration camps. This is something that the libertarian right has been talking about since the early 90s. Linda Thompson, who was an attorney who made a video called Waco the Big Lie, she'd go around the lecture circuit in the early 90s, right after David Koresh and Waco, after that happened. And she was peddling this video. And she was saying that at any moment the New World Order was going to take over, and they were building these concentration camps on American soil, and all the Christian patriots were going to be thrown into these camps. So this is a consistent theme amongst the far right.
And the UFO community.
Absolutely. At some point there's an overlap. In fact, one of the sources of QAnon is a book called Operation Vampire Killer 2000, which was a saddle-stitched kind of chapbook, booklet, I guess you could say, that was published early 90s. I ordered away for it. I mean, I got one of the early copies of this. I still have the same copy. And mainly because of the title. It said Operation Vampire Killer 2000 and then it was said by Police Against the New World Order. I thought, I got to get a copy of that. And so I was fascinated that this is like 92, 93. It's before Oklahoma City bombing, right? And it was written by a group of retired and active police officers who were concerned. They were libertarians, but they weren't Republicans. In fact, they hated Republicans. And they were very much concerned about the militarization of the police. And when I read that book, I thought, this is interesting. This is like an opportunity. You could these people have the same concerns as a lot of progressives, so you could actually, this could be a bridge between these two extremes. But that was quickly lost because then the militia movement got overrun by paranoia, and eventually that led to Oklahoma City bombing. But that book, Operation Vampire Killer 2000, that is one of the early source materials that I write about in Operation Mindfuck.
And I remember I was looking through my UFO magazines today because I've got, oh my gosh, I've started dating back since the start of that magazine, and that was on one of the covers. And I remember just seeing that. It was a very striking cover, and I'm like, okay, I need to obviously read this later. And then, you look at the UFO magazines and see the FEMA camps and rounding up people. And then we've got the DNA and, all of this stuff that it really has been brewing for, decade after decade. And a team of people actually have just tapped into this. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. Do you think that because you see people like, Robert Bigelow and his little special friends who've been data mining forever, would there be an advantage to him to take the data that he has purchased from the MUFON database and then use that to figure out how to manipulate people?
It's interesting. I saw an article that said that he was one of the major supporters of financial backers of Ron DeSantis in Florida. I just saw an article about that. In Operation Mindfuck, let me go back a few steps. Right before we went on the show, you mentioned that you actually have some family members who are into QAnon,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's sort of similar to my experience in the sense that in March of 2020, it was just after the lockdown. I was talking to an old friend of mine the phone. And I had been aware of QAnon when it first popped up, which was October of 2017 on 4chan. I had friends who were following it. I have a friend who was right there when the first post appeared. But I wasn't paying much attention to it because it didn't seem like it was worthy of my attention. But it was March of 2020. I was talking to a friend of mine. He's in his late 50s. He's about 10 years older than me. And he lives in the Midwest. And we started talking about COVID-19, and I was talking about the difficulty of teaching my classes online and just all of that. I hadn't spoken to him in a while. And he starts telling me how COVID's going to be a positive development in 2020. And he starts talking about what's going to happen when Trump is elected. When he's reelected, he's going to bring in free energy. He's going to abolish the income tax. Military troops at that moment were cleaning out covert military tunnels and saving these kids who had been kidnapped by the, quote, the black hats, unquote. And I said, what, where are you getting this information? Can you send me some links? So he sends me the links and to these QAnon posts and these videos, and I immediately detect something that would not be obvious to anyone who hadn't been intimately familiar with conspiracy theories for the past 3 decades. And that is that most of the elements that made up this whole QAnon mythos narrative had clearly been pilfered from these previous sources that most people would not know about, and some of them going back to the late 1800s. And so the most fascinating pattern I noticed immediately is that when I say they, I mean Team QAnon, because it was immediately clear to me that this was not just one person. It wasn't just one person posting his Q. I mean, I teach creative writing, I teach literature, I'm used to analyzing writing styles. It was clear that it was more than one person, just immediately right off the bat. It was clear to me that they would take a conspiracy theory that the original content of which was essentially anti-fascist at its core, and it doesn't matter if the conspiracy theory was true or not. The fact is that whatever it was generally anti-fascist at its core. They would take that conspiracy theory and then they would flip it so that now it was pro-fascist, pro-conservative, pro-martial law, as I already mentioned, and in the end, pro-Trump. And what I found fascinating about that is that there was a whole bunch of conspiracy theorists and people who were into that kind of thing who, if the same thing had been done a few years earlier with, say, George W. Bush, if there was some conspiracy theory that had been floating around and the punchline of it was vote for George W. Bush, I think most of these people would take a step back and say, oh, I see. This is obviously, um, a propaganda ploy to get me to vote for George W. Bush. But for some reason, when it came to Trump, that same natural skepticism did not kick in. And partly because Trump had successfully presented himself as an anti-globalist candidate, which is ridiculous, but a lot of people bought that. And so in the book, I start naming, examples of this pattern, and I mentioned Operation Vampire Killer 2000, um, um, and other conspiracy theories like Mae Brussel. Mae Brussel, who was known as the Queen of Conspiracies. She was a Jewish woman who was fascinated by the Kennedy assassination, and she um, went out of her way to index the entire Warren Commission report. The Warren Commission report was released with no index, so she actually went in and indexed the whole thing herself. And she, along with a lot of other Kennedy assassination researchers like her, Dick Gregory, Mark Lane, Sherman Skolnick, they started researching the Kennedy assassination when Oswald was killed. And so Mae Brussel had her own radio show, Conspiracy Dialogue, that she hosted from the 60s, 70s into the 80s until she died of cancer in, I think, 6. Uh, Mae Brussel came up with this conspiracy theory about Operation Chaos, where she thought that a lot of rock and roll stars from the 60s, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, were being assassinated because of their anti-Vietnam War stance. So whether that's true or not, that essentially is an anti-fascist conspiracy theory. Well, there was this thinly veiled QAnon recruitment video called Out of Shadows that came out right around when the pandemic starts. And in that documentary, they take the Mae Brussel theory of the rock and roll stars being assassinated to prevent them from swaying the youth towards an anti-Vietnam War stance. They take that and they flip it. So now they claim that, in fact, what was happening is that Frank Zappa and Jim Morrison, because they had parents who were in the military, that somehow this proves that they were actually MK Ultra puppets who were going around the country like Pied Pipers, leading our pure Christian white youth away from traditional American values and into experimenting with LSD and other consciousness-altering chemicals. Now, this is a theory that kind of extends all the way back to Lyndon LaRouche, who was a far-right loon who was constantly running for president until he died. LaRouche had a similar theory that the Beatles were MK Ultra, genetically engineered MK Ultra puppets who were sent to America to lead the youth into experimenting with LSD. It's in my experience that American teenagers don't need any nudging to experiment with mind-altering substances. I don't think you need to devise a conspiracy theory about that. But the fascinating thing about QAnon is that they will often take something that has a kernel of truth and then build and then flip it so that it's no longer anti-fascist. It's supporting fascism. And so, I mean, there is some truth to the MK Ultra, the CIA being involved in LSD research, and all that is true. I mean, there was an MK Ultra. There were CIA scientists like Louis Jolyon West and Sidney Gottlieb experimenting with LSD in Haight-Ashbury, and setting up laboratories and observing how people would react to LSD and all that. That all actually happened, So they'll take something that actually happened, and then they'll flip it and flip it again, and then finally lead you off into the Twilight Zone with the stuff that actually did occur, and try to convince you that, well, eventually you will accept that, yes, Satanists are controlling the Democratic Party and Donald Trump is the only one who can save us.
And that I did see that Out of Shadows. In fact, one of my friends told me to watch that, whenever it first came out. And I mean, it was very glitzy, and you could see how it would kind of pull people in and make people feel empowered. And that was obviously at a time when COVID was raging, and there were lots of people and friends that I know that were in the New Age and health and wellness communities that were sucked into this and are still involved in things like that. And it's just like, oh, okay. And it's amazing, like, how big of a, this kind of crap infiltrated so many communities. And it was a brilliant effort. Diabolical, but it was brilliant.
I think that's one of the most fascinating things about it. Like, if you go back to look at, say, George W. Bush's campaign, he targeted evangelicals. And it was almost as if somebody said, why limit us to that when we could get this big tent instead? So evangelical right-wingers are a huge part of QAnon, but by no means are they the only followers of QAnon. It appeals to a whole bunch of different people. There are like people who are into the paranormal, people who are into high weirdness, accelerationists, libertarians, I know former Democrats who just fell down the QAnon hole. I think partly it was a result of, I had a student who was only like 19 at the time, but he was like a huge Bernie guy. So when there was a lot of people who they had their their hopes hanging on Bernie Sanders. And so when that didn't pan out, there was this kind of disappointment, and there was a lot of people who were supporters of Bernie that suddenly went just full on Trump QAnon, which is bizarre. But I think it's because Trump successfully tried to present himself as this anti-globalist candidate, while showing no evidence that was the case. It also taps into a lot of paranoid strains that go all the way back to even before Nazi Germany. I mean, a lot of anti-Semites are also anti-Freemasonry, and the anti-Masonic thing is really woven into all of this, and that goes all the way back to Leo Taxel's anti-Masonic book, The Mysteries of Freemasonry, from the 1870s, and he concocted this whole hoax, and he admitted later on that it was a hoax. He made up this woman named Diana Vaughn, who was supposedly a demonic woman who could shapeshift. She actually shapeshifted into a reptile and played the piano, he claimed, which is interesting because it.
Oh, God, that sounds like a date I had a couple weeks ago. Just kidding.
It precedes David Icke and the whole shape-shifting reptilian thing, but this is back in the 1870s, this was a huge success because Diana Vaughn supposedly was this woman who she was giving everybody the lowdown on Freemasonry and how they were really devil worshippers and etc. And this was a huge success among Roman Catholics who just loved to eat up scare stories about Freemasonry. And even though Taxel, he admitted that it was a hoax, and he said it was the most fantastic hoax of our times, and it went on for 12 years. He kept it going for 12 years. Nonetheless, even though he admitted it, you still see Leo Taxel stuff being used. You see it used in QAnon. There was a guy named Jack T. Chick, who you might be familiar with, who's infamous for being he was a evangelical Christian cartoonist who produced all these little rectangular pamphlets, and I used to collect them back in high school. I would find them like just on bus stops and things, and I eventually amassed a huge collection of Jack T. Chick pamphlets, and cool. One of them was called The Curse of Baphomet, and it was all about the horrors of Freemasonry. Each Jack T. Chick pamphlet was about the horrors of something other than evangelical Christianity. It was like the horrors of Dungeons and Dragons, the horrors of celebrating Halloween, the horrors of Mormonism, the horrors of everything. There was one that was about the horrors of Freemasonry, and it was called The Curse of Baphomet. And in there, it actually quotes from Leo Taxel. So the anti-Masonic stuff has gotten so crazy that last year, I'd say in 2020 and 2021, there was just this huge rise in assaults on Masonic lodges, which hasn't really been reported very much in the news. But there was in July of 2022, a Tennessee firefighter, Leslie Roy Winchester. He was arrested for setting a Masonic lodge on fire. On June 27, 2022, a suspect was arrested after breaking into the Scottish Rite Masonic Center in Houston and holding two men hostage, 65-year-old guy and a 91-year-old man. Because these are the 65-year-old guy and the 91-year-old man, they're the guys who are controlling everything. And the guy came in and held them hostage. On the night of June 2nd or the morning of June 3rd, two large Sphinx sculptures located at the entrance of the Scottish Rite Temple in Washington, D.C., were severely damaged and smeared with filth. In April of 2022, a 36-year-old man assaulted a Masonic lodge in Greece, and he came out with an axe and a shotgun, and he started knocking on the door with the axe. On February 18th, 2022, a guy named Howard Lovelady Jr. was arrested for using a metal baseball bat to inflict massive damage on Masonic lodges all across Illinois. San Bernardino's Scottish Rite Temple burst into flames twice, once in 2022 and the first time in February 2021. This is an interesting one because this really gets to the heart of it. On New Year's Eve 2021, someone tried to burn down the Grand Lodge of Ireland. So no, this is not just America. This is not just like the Deep South. This is Ireland. It's Greece. It's all over the world. On New Year's Eve, someone tried to burn down the Grand Lodge of Ireland. Anti-vaccination graffiti was spray painted on the sidewalk directly outside the building. According to the Irish Times, the graffiti is understood to be a reference to mRNA, the technology used in some COVID-19 vaccines. The Grand Lodge of Freemasons of Ireland Grand Secretary Philip Daly described the attack as very serious and completely out of the blue. However, he said there had been previous demonstrations outside the hall and other Masonic halls in Ireland by anti-vaccination campaigners. The view is that we created the virus and we are part of the New World Order and we have to be stopped. So see, these people thought the Freemasons had created the virus, and anti-vaxxers had attacked the Masonic Hall. In May of 2021, 3 neo-Nazis were arrested for trying to blow up a Masonic lodge located in the eastern region of France. In September of 2021, 2 neo-Nazis were arrested in connection with the planned assault. On March 30th, 2021, a 42-year-old man named Benjamin Coleman was arrested for setting 3 Masonic lodges on fire in Vancouver. And on his social media, he bragged that he had just cleaned 3 satanic clubhouses and nobody could stop me. There's a guy named Christopher Hodapp, who's a Freemason, Hodapp, and he actually has been documented numerous instances of assaults on Masonic lodges that go way beyond this. There's Pastor Gary Locke of Tennessee. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he says that there goes around literally finding witches in his church. He thinks his church has been overrun by witches and Freemasons. And he actually had a book burning in Tennessee and in Florida. It says here, Gary Locke of Tennessee regularly urges his audiences to destroy everything Masonic, and has unfortunately gotten increased airplay online in the last few weeks. Most recently, Locke held a highly publicized book burning event in Florida, consigning Harry Potter and Twilight books to the flames, along with, by the way, Fahrenheit 451, with absolutely no sense of irony whatsoever. Declaring Freemasonry to be satanic, his anti-Masonic rant from that event has been endlessly forwarded around social media. There's also another article here from Religious News, February 15th of last year. It says that Gary Locke began telling his church about his conversations with demons. I think it's interesting that he talks to demons. Mm-hmm. Those demons, he said, had revealed the names of a group of full-blown spell-casting witches who'd been sent to infiltrate Global Vision, a non-denominational church east of Nashville, Tennessee, where Locke is pastor. To God be the glory, I lie not, he told the congregation at Global Vision on Sunday, which was meeting in a packed tent on the church's property. We got first and last names of 6 witches that are in our church. And you know what's strange? 3 of you are in this room right now. I would love to have been there. Everyone's just looking straight ahead. They don't want to be the one to think that, I hope they don't think I'm the witch, right? Locke told the congregation that he'd gotten the names while casting a demon out of a woman who had recently begun coming to Global Vision. The preacher, known for his sensationalist sermons about politics and COVID-19 skepticism, went on to describe the exorcism in detail, quoting a demon with scruffy voice who accused worshippers of the church of being witches. 2 of the witches were in his wife's Bible study, said Locke, who warned the alleged witches not to make a move during his sermon. He then retold the New Testament story of Jesus casting a demon out of a man and into a herd of pigs, turning it into an extended monologue about witches in the church. You so much as cough wrong, and I'll expose you in front of everybody under this tent, you stinking, spell-casting, pharmakia, devil-worshipping mongrel, he said. He has a way with words, obviously. Mm-hmm. You were sent to destroy this church. In recent years, Locke has used his sermons to attack LGBTQ people, accuse Democratic politicians of child abuse, spread claims about election fraud, denounce vaccines, and claim that the COVID-19 pandemic is a hoax. During Sunday's sermon, he blamed witchcraft for an outbreak of illness in the church. I think it's fascinating that the accusations of the fascination with pedophilia that runs throughout QAnon, it really makes you wonder. They really seem to focus on it a lot. They really seem to be thinking about it. a whole
Right.
hell of a lot.
Absolutely. And I've just got to say that it's interesting to see how, you've got people that are actually true activists who've been doing work for decades. And then, the Save the Children thing comes out. And I mean, obviously we care about children. And that's one of the things that, one of the hooks you can sink into people is, let's, of course, we want to save the children. Of course, we don't want them to be victimized. But the organizations that are actually doing good are being harmed by the QAnon movement and things. And it's interesting because there are some organizations here in Utah that are more than questionable that have jumped on that bandwagon and received a lot of funding to do that. And at the end of the day, I'm not quite sure what's behind that, but it certainly seems to be like a, if you're saying that you're against, child trafficking and things, and you're supporting a specific movement, then you've got a lot of steam behind you and potentially, unfortunately, a way to exploit the topic and get some funding for yourself.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the Save the Children. I mean that's always the excuse, isn't it? If you can figure out a way, and as I wrote about in the introduction to Operation Mindfuck, that a lot of these people who, as you say, are actual activists trying to prevent child trafficking, which is a real problem. That they've been people who are actually involved in that type of activism have said how the entire Save the Children QAnon movement has actually blocked them from saving children from child trafficking. Um, so what one wonders, or what's the real agenda behind all of this? Um, yeah,
Yes.
go on.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, you do wonder what the real agenda is, and you could go down a few paths on that, in that regard, wondering what the true agenda is when people are going to places where the trafficking, child sex trafficking, is really a problem. Afghanistan and some of these places. And and then again, like I mentioned, you've got these companies that have been created, these nonprofits that have been created that are allegedly doing this wonderful work, and yet where is anything to show for that other than a few videos of them pounding their chest and talking about how they're going to storm a certain place, and nothing is really done. And that's concerning. We should really be digging into that and looking at some of the ways that certain topics can be used to manipulate people to garner funds. It's like you say, we're going to save the children, we're going to save the dogs, we're saving the animals, and a lot of really good-hearted people that don't know any better are donating their funds, and that's unfortunately been one of the grifts in the UFO world since its inception. And now we see this on a broader scale with QAnon and some of these things. And that really is, we need to start doing some fact checking and get it
Well,
together.
in the art of war, they talk about how you always have to accuse your enemy of whatever it is that you're doing. And in the case of Southern Baptists and Catholics, like accusing Masons of being involved in pedophilia, and this is like a huge part of QAnon. Uh, Last year, there was a huge 300-page report about the Baptist Church being involved of hiding all of these child molesters, and this is stuff that was documented. This is and there's all these, of course, the Catholic Church being involved in hiding uh, actual child molesters, of shifting them around, sending them to other churches in other countries in Mexico to get them to prevent them from being um, convicted of these crimes. So you see massive cover-ups in the Catholic Church and Southern Baptists of actual real child molestation going on, and yet QAnon doesn't seem to be interested in that. They're- and instead, I mean, they're accusing uh, part of the QAnon narrative is that kids are being, uh, in, imprisoned and tortured, and yet the only known documented case of that is actually the Trump administration putting immigrant kids in cages. So so you always accuse the enemy of doing what you're doing. The
And The
Trump,
Art of
the
War, I
woman.
just have to say that is one of my all-time favorites. That is a really important piece to read.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. That, and also I would recommend people reading a book by Aldous Huxley called Brave New World Revisited, which is a follow-up, a nonfiction follow-up to Brave New World. He wrote Brave New World in the 30s, and in 1958 he wrote Brave New World Revisited, a series of essays where he's asking the question, how close have we gotten to the science fictional dystopia that I wrote about in 1930s? And I always, in my basic entry-level composition classes that I teach at CSU Long Beach, I always have the students read 4 chapters from that book. I think it's chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. And I really recommend people go and read chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 of Brave New World Revisited. They're very short, but it's eerie how much it parallels what's going on now. And particularly with the use of social media to spread misinformation and disinformation. And in fact, the book Operation Mindfuck, I actually started off with a quote from Brave New World Revisited. But I highly recommend reading those 4 chapters. And in the sense of the concept of accusing people of what you yourself are doing, keep in mind that a woman came out. We never found out the name of the woman, but she came out and said she was going to sue Donald Trump. This was before the Epstein stuff exploded, before Epstein was arrested and all that. She came out and said that she was raped by Donald Trump in Epstein's house in New York when she was 13. That story went away because that woman decided not to pursue that case. And then it was soon after that that QAnon pops up in October of 2017 when Donald Trump was at his lowest approval ratings. You can look that up. That's absolutely true. QAnon first pops up on 4chan when Donald Trump is at his lowest approval ratings. And so what do you get? You get a narrative in which Donald Trump is not the sexual predator. No, no, no. He's the one who's saving the kids. Right? And this was a brilliant, brilliant scheme of getting ahead of Epstein, who was about to be arrested, but no one knew that yet. And so they got ahead of it with this QAnon mythology about Trump being the one who's actually trying to save the children. And of course, Trump is on page 85 of Epstein's little book. So the same QAnon people who are so upset about Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton being in Epstein's book, which they are, and yet how do they reconcile the fact that Trump is also in that little book? And
He was framed, totally framed.
They would say if video came out of Trump, in bed with like a hairless preteen with Jeffrey Epstein videotaping it all, they would say that's a deep fake, or no, Trump had to do that in order to infiltrate the the child trafficking organization. They would just come up with some excuse as to why Trump is not actually guilty of what we can all see with our own eyes.
And it's just mind-blowing to me. It's like, I mean, here you have piles of evidence. Like, at what point do you really think that that you can't look at reality? And we see this in the UFO community. It's just like, okay, this guy, and I remember like when Jan Harzan was arrested, the head of the former executive director of MUFON, for soliciting a minor. And, I heard from people that were saying, oh my gosh, he was arrested because he was this close to disclosing. And you've heard that, time after time with some of the pedophiles in the world of ufology. And it's just like, my Lord, at what point are we going to just stand up and use our brains and think about things and not let these people infiltrate our communities or turn things around when they're actually the perpetrators? It blows my mind.
I mentioned the Out of Shadows documentary earlier, which is a complete QAnon recruitment video. Though I don't think they ever actually mentioned QAnon in the video. They do go into Pizzagate quite a bit in the latter half hour of it. which is the progenitor of QAnon. Um, they they begin the documentary by saying that it's going to be a documentary all about how Hollywood is sort of used to spread propaganda, which is a perfectly legitimate thesis, to explore. And in fact, in the Hollywood Haunts the World book I'm working on, there's a chapter that's devoted to that very subject. And so they spend like the first 8 minutes on that, Hollywood being used to spread propaganda. Then it quickly goes off into the Twilight Zone, and they start at one point they go into Michael Aquino, who's passed away now, and I don't know exactly why they go into Aquino, because supposedly it's all about the intersection between Hollywood and the intelligence community, but I don't know that Aquino had much of a connection to Hollywood. But Aquino, co-wrote this intelligence briefing called Mind War about psychological warfare, because Aquino was a psychological warfare officer. That was his field of expertise, right? And the Mind War paper, which most conspiracy and UFO people would be familiar with because of William Cooper's Behold a Pale Horse. Cooper published Mind War in Behold a Pale Horse. Aquino was approached by his superior, Paul Vallely, to write this report, because Paul Vallely said this was in the early 80s, so post-Vietnam, and Paul Vallely came to Michael Aquino and said, I want you to write this report about how does the field of psychological warfare, how can it adapt to this new era, this digital era that we find ourselves in. And so Aquino writes this whole thing about how, well, in the digital environment, post-Vietnam, psychological warfare has to be done differently. It has to be done in such a way where the person who is the propagandist, who's spreading the propaganda, has to believe what they're saying, and that this sincerity will act as almost on an ESP level with his followers, or the people to whom he's transmitting the propaganda. They will detect the sincerity, and he says at one point that it'll work almost like ESP level. They will be able to detect at an unconscious level the sincerity if the propagandist actually believes what he is saying. Now, what's fascinating is at no point does the documentary mention, and now they go into this to imply, because Aquino was a Satanist, or technically he wasn't a Satanist, he was a Setian. At one point he was a member of the Church of Satan, and then he broke away because they weren't hardcore enough. So he started the Temple of Set, right? So he was a military officer and, involved in the occult. So he got swept up in the satanic panic in the 80s. He appeared on an episode of Oprah Winfrey to try to defend himself. He was accused of being involved in some sort of child trafficking ring working out of the Presidio in San Francisco. He was found to be innocent of those crimes in a court of law, and then attained some amount of fame or infamy in the UFO conspiracy community because of his paper being included in Behold a Pale Horse. And so he pops up in this documentary, and they do it to imply that this mind war kind of technique was being used on the American people. And QAnon is there to combat that. At no point does the documentary mention that the co-author of Mind War was Paul Vallely, Aquino's superior, the one who asked him to write the paper. So Aquino's superior, Major General Paul E. Vallely, he's a well-respected West Point graduate. He served 2 tours of Vietnam. He commanded special forces, psychological warfare, and civil military units in the United States. He's been a military analyst for Fox News. He co-authored a book called Endgame.
Are you there, Robert? I think we just lost you. Okay. Okay, I think we have lost Robert for the moment. Sound just dropped off, but I can still see him on here behind the scenes, so hopefully he will come back on. Okay, there you go. I can kind of hear you again.
Oh, did I
You
go
dropped
out?
off. Yeah, you did.
What was the last thing you heard?
It was you were just talking about oh my gosh, this was like a minute ago when you dropped out.
Okay, well, just to make
So,
sure to reiterate,
yeah, just
the Out of the Shadows documentary, it goes on and on about Michael Aquino and about this mind war paper, and that the mind war techniques were being used on the American population, and QAnon is there to combat it. But they don't mention that the co-author of Mind War was Paul Vallely, the guy who asked Aquino to write the paper. Paul Vallely was the only military official to come out in public support of QAnon. He went on several different radio shows, and he said that QAnon is tied to information that comes out of a group called the Army of Northern Virginia. And he said, and this is a direct quote, "This is a group of military intelligence specialists of over 800 people that advise the president," meaning Trump. "The president does not have a lot of confidence in the CIA or even the DIA much anymore, so he relies on real operators who are mostly special operations type of people. This is where Q picks up some of his information." So this caused a huge ripple of excitement in the QAnon community, because here was official confirmation, right, that Q was no hoaxer, that this was real. And yet Vallely also co-wrote the paper that the QAnon recruitment video Out of Shadows calls a psychological operation directed against the American domestic population, right? So which is it? So if you read Mind War, you see that Aquino and Vallely lay out a blueprint for manipulation, disinformation, and misinformation that perfectly mirrors Out of Shadows and all these other QAnon videos and podcasts. There was a woman named Radix Virum who started Patriot Soapbox. This was one of the early podcast YouTube channels that was a proponent of QAnon. She has since come out and said, I think I was naive and that I was being manipulated. And she talked about how Jerome Corsi, who we mentioned earlier, who's been on Coast to Coast a billion times, Jerome Corsi is the one who dreamed up the whole birther, Obama birth certificate thing. Jerome Corsi is suddenly hanging out in the subreddit, in the QAnon subreddit, that this little YouTube channel is hosting. And he pops up and they're impressed. They're like, "Oh, we know who Jerome Corsi is. He's a columnist for World.net Daily. He works on InfoWars with Alex Jones. He's a friend of Trump." And suddenly Jerome Corsi's popping in, interacting with them, saying, "Oh yes, what you're doing is absolutely correct. Keep pushing the QAnon thing. Q's real. We're fighting for American freedom." And she even talked about how he took them out to lunch. And was saying that he said, "Oh, yeah, I know who the next Israeli ambassador is going to be," and he showed a picture on his phone of who this would be. And then, like a few weeks later, that guy turned out to be appointed as the new Israeli ambassador. So that gave them the sense, oh, he has insider information. He's a friend of Trump. We've seen photos of him with Trump. This guy actually knows what's going on. So they believed everything he was saying, and they were promoting it on the Patriot Soapbox. You can multiply this with all these other QTubers. I mentioned the guy earlier, Gene Decode, who was on the Blessed to Teach show, who was coming on every day to say that he had special contacts in the government who was giving him information about these deep underground military bases. And he would show paintings and present them as photographs of the deep underground military bases.
Wow.
And I'll sit there and think, are the people watching this, they don't notice it's a painting?
Oh my God.
I was wondering, like, does this Gene guy, is he bright enough to come up with all this himself? And then I realized, as I listened to it for several months, that no, he's not bright enough to come up with this stuff. When he says that he has these intelligence officers who are contacting him, I think he's actually telling the truth as he sees it. And for some reason, he believed whatever it is these people were telling him, just like Radix was believing everything that Jerome Corsi was telling her. She's one of the few cases who has actually come out and said, oh, yeah, I was wrong. I was manipulated. So this is a perfect parallel to the Mind War paper, where back in the 80s, Aquino said, in the digital era, the propagandist has to believe what they're saying. So how do you do that? Well, so the perfect propagandist is one who, A, doesn't know that they're a propagandist, and B, is completely sincere. That's worth all the gold in the world. So I think that you begin to see the architecture of the entire QAnon mythos and how it was constructed. So you had people like Roger Stone, people like Jerome Corsi, other unnamed people who are close to Trump, who are actually interacting with these Q-tubers and encouraging them. And so the propagandists became the people who were hosting the QAnon podcast, but they didn't know they were propagandists. They thought they were sincere, fighters for freedom. And I think that's how the whole thing was structured from the beginning. And January 6th, as I was listening to all these QAnon podcasts, I knew it was mounting to some sort of firework display. I didn't know exactly when it would come, if it was going to be January 6th, January 20th, or whenever. But I knew something explosive was going to happen, particularly when I heard them a few days before January 6th saying, oh, if you see the military coming down the street, don't go for your guns. Just let them do whatever they're going to have to do, trust the military. So when January 6th happened, I thought, okay, this was plan B all along, or plan Q. If Trump saw that he was losing the election, okay, we activate plan Q. And the whole January 6th thing, all the MAGA people and the QAnon people were cover. They were cover for the real operation, which was those guys that you saw in the photos with the camo fatigues, camera mounted on the chest, the handcuffs and the zip ties on their belts. Those were the real those were the real people who were going in. They were going to truss up Pelosi, Schumer, Mike Pence. They were building nooses for Mike Pence, and they were going to probably take hostages, and they were going to do either Al-Qaeda style, just start executing people until they got what they wanted. And it's only just, I don't think people realize, it was only just coincidences that prevented January 6th from being far more bloody than it actually turned out to be. There was one police officer who, the doors to the floor of Congress was unlocked, and the crowd, the MAGA crowd, was coming right towards it, and this one police officer led them away from those doors.
That was amazing. I mean, I can't even imagine how frightened he must have been, but he did exactly what I needed to do, and so did so many other, brave men and women. When you're looking at a crowd like that, and you just think, what...
Well, and it's amazing what the even mainstream conservatives are trying to flip January 6th around. And as I mentioned Newsmax earlier, there's a blockhead on there called Greg Kelly, and his program is just completely just full on QAnon program. And every night he'll talk about January 6th, and he claims that January 6th there was one, they were showing footage from the January 6th committee. And there was one Capitol police officer who was black, and he was talking about all the racial epithets being thrown at him by these MAGA people. And Greg Kelly slams his fist down on the table and says, "That never happened."
Oh, good Lord.
And this guy, Greg Kelly, whose father was the New York police commissioner, he just published a book, from a mainstream publisher. I can't remember, Simon & Schuster or something, called Justice for All, and he claims it's in support of law enforcement. Well, of course, if you're a cop who is trying to prevent an insurrection at the Capitol, suddenly you don't get any support. I mean, that's the thing that flipped people out. You saw all these guys who are supposedly MAGA people wearing Blue Lives Matter T-shirts, beating cops over the heads, chasing them up the stairs, because, of course, in their view, if you are doing anything to try to prevent Trump from acceding to the throne, then you're no longer a blue life. You're a demon in human form who needs to be exorcised or just gotten rid of completely. So the conservative support for law enforcement sort of dissipates if it in any way prevents Trump from gaining power. By the way, I thought of this the other day. You know how Trump won in 2020, right? According to the QAnon MAGA people, Trump won. So, and even some of them even say that Trump's still flying around covertly on Air Force One, right?
Right.
So if that's the case, how can he win a third time in 2024? You see, this is completely unconstitutional. If he won in 2020, he can't run again in 2024. So by their own logic, he can't run in 2024.
Well, as we've seen, there is really no logic when it comes to all of this. And I want to just point out a comment that Steve Long made in chat. And he said, when you were talking about kind of that indoctrination, it's exactly how Elizondo, Mellon, Nolan, Taylor do the same thing. They plots and they promise YouTubers, and they find these groups of people on YouTube, and then they bring them behind the scenes and basically make them feel special and indoctrinate them and get these. I mean, I'm sure that they're actually really good people that get indoctrinated and then are the minions that go out there on social media and try to destroy other people, because they've gotten props from Elizondo, or they've gotten props from Taylor or Fugel or people like that. And it's really, I'm glad to see that the UFO community is starting to call this out, because it's pretty sick.
Well, that's similar to what we saw on January 6th. Like I said, I suspect that a lot of those people did not go there expecting to commit crimes. But I wrote down in my notebook that day, I wrote, the QAnon architects are the equivalent of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda created by Joseph Goebbels. The Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are the Brown Shirts and the SS, respectively. And so you had the MAGA people there, who many of them were probably sincere, if misled. And then the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are there with the agenda, with the real agenda. And then the MAGA people are left to swing in the wind. Now, that's why you had a bunch of QAnon suicides. There were a lot of people who came home the next day. They either blew their brains out. Some of them tried to flee the country. And when that didn't work, they tried to commit suicide. So there were actual QAnon suicides, attempted suicides. Because, like you said, just like what you just mentioned, a lot of them are probably sincere people. And they realized, man, I just got taken for a ride. And some of them still have not woken up to that. And in terms of the UFO connection, which oddly enough, UFOs don't figure into the original QAnon posts so much, which is interesting, because I read an interview with Trump somewhere where they asked him about UFOs, and Trump said, I don't really. I'm not really into UFOs. I just thought it was interesting. Like, one of the few conspiracy theories he's not into, it doesn't play like a major role in the QAnon mythos. But there's always been a strong link between outright fascism or neo-Nazi beliefs and UFOs, going back to the 40s. With the contactees. It appears in a subtle way in terms of the blondes.
That's really subtle.
Relatively subtle as compared to, say, later UFO cults that actually have swastikas as their symbol.
Okay, well, I mean, but I will say that the tall, benevolent, blonde-haired, blue-eyed space beings are holding up their arm in a peculiar way that would be reminiscent of, maybe Hitler and things. And so, yeah, that whole thing is just fascinating. I mean, it's disturbing.
Who was the guy who had the cult where his symbol, he said he was given the symbol by an alien, and it was the swastika embedded in the Star of David?
Oh, Lord, I should know this. And anybody in chat, please feel free to Give us the answer. Yeah, that's really special. And I want to just throw this out here because there are people that are in chat that I really respect a lot. And there are people in the UFO community who've become very popular, YouTubers, and they're promoting messages and things. And yet nobody's looking at the subtle comments that they're making, and nobody's looking at the tattoos that they're sporting, which are very clearly Aryan tattoos. And it's like, okay, at what point are we going to get a grip and understand that this is happening? Yes, precisely. The Nazi UFOs, the Real Society conspiracy. And yeah, I mean, this is disturbing. And this honestly has been part of the UFO community for a long, long time.
And also, I think maybe a lot of people who aren't directly connected to the UFO community might have this image of people who are into UFOs being more like New Agers, granola munching New Agers who are into hippy-dippy things. But in fact, if you go all the way back to the contactees, a lot of them were conservatives. I mean, if you go, I found a photo of one of the giant rock when they would have the UFO gatherings at Giant Rock back in the late 40s and 50s, and you see the people who are there, and they look like the straightest, whitest conservative people you've ever seen in your life, and there's always been a strong sort of right-wing conservative faction of ufology who tend to be sort of nuts and bolts kind of people. Like, they're interested in the technology aspect of it. They're interested in how do you figure out how, if this technology is real, how do we kind of back engineer it on our own and figure out how to make our own version of it. They're kind of like into the aviation aspect of the whole thing. So there's always been like a conservative interest in ufology going all the way back to the beginning.
Absolutely. Oh, and you look at Major Donald Kehoe, and I mean,
Sure.
it's just the whole thing is very interesting. I want to ask you, because I know we're getting ready to close the show, and this is probably not the right time to ask you, but when, CHAMELEO, your work, that whole thing, I interviewed you on UFO Classified a couple times, and it was really interesting because obviously Jacques Vallée has referenced your work, and the people at, George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, and that has been referenced many, many times. What do you think their game is to reference things like that and the non-lethal weapons technology aspect? Because my opinions on that have changed drastically over the years.
Well, it's if it opens up possibilities, doesn't it? If you are in any way questioning the presence of a paranormal phenomenon connected to Skinwalker, you could then go to explanation B, which is that it's some form of high technology, right? And then you could say that it's a technology that's top secret, that we don't know anything about it. In which case, how do you document that, right? I thought it was interesting that in the Atlantic article, I think it was the Atlantic, did a very long, long by I mean like 10,000 word article about the whole Elizondo story. And there was one point where they mentioned Harry Reid being brought out to the Skinwalker Ranch, and that he wanted to see some sort of phenomenon for himself, and that they took him to some trailer there, and he claimed that he saw some sort of odd geometric form like floating in the air. And if you read CHAMELEO, and what I know from my friend Dion and from knowing Richard Schoengert, who recently passed away, Richard Schoengert had over 50 years of experience in the DoD. That they have technology that could easily create something like a geometric form flying in the air, and then and Harry Reid seeing that was what prompted everything else. In other words, that was the beginning of the dominoes falling to lead to the whole Elizondo story. So I thought it was interesting that they brought Harry Reid out. He said he wanted to see something, and almost like clockwork, he saw it. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, right. Or he allegedly says that he saw it. I mean, there's so many things, and
Sure.
like, you and I have been, we've known each other for a few years, and you've seen me go from one end of the skinwalker spectrum to the other. And I've always just found it really interesting how CHAMELEO is used as it's almost a way that these people, these myth makers, throw people off.
It can be used in that way. I was fascinated by the fact that when you and Chris Marks contacted me, I talked to him for like 2 hours, and he seemed utterly sincere in saying that now he felt that all the paranormal stuff he had seen was maybe connected to this instead. And Now I question if he was actually sincere in that, or
Well,
I mean,
I do
what do you
too.
think?
You know what? I mean, and that's the thing. And I just want to say, Steve Long, I mean, he was mentioning that Jay Stratton was the person that saw the Mobius shape. And I know that Harry Reid, I mean, well, we could get into that another time. But thanks, Jay, or excuse me, Steve, for mentioning that. But I think that, when I was involved with Chris, when I first got involved with Chris, thanks to Ryan Skinner and, having known Eric Davis and the players and the in that whole thing, I of course I thought this was paranormal. There was something to that, and the more that I began to research and the things that started to come out, I questioned, okay, what is the motivation at Skinwalker? Because clearly they were not doing anything of scientific value. I mean, there were no cameras anywhere, and the one camera that was there had been cut allegedly by some unknown force, but according to Junior Hicks, it was cut by a human being. And so, why would they put people in a specific area? Was this a grift? Was this a real world scenario to test non-lethal weapons technologies? And I mean, there's so much to that. I mean, there is a huge industry here in Utah, and I can I can see people like Bigelow and other people using or testing non-lethal weapons technologies in a place like that.
Sure,
But
absolutely.
I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I mentioned, Damien, when he went through his experiences in San Diego, was living within walking distance of corporations like ATC and SAIC. And SAIC was located across the street from the Old Town area in San Diego, where the Whaley House was located. And the Whaley House is notorious for being supposedly the most haunted house in California. And I thought, why was SAIC built in that location? Like, why did they build it right across the street from the Whaley House? Now, one could say either that there's something special about the geography. There's perhaps it's a window area, right, using John Keel language, or is it that if you're experimenting with this sort of exotic technology, it's convenient to have it located to some notorious place like the Whaley House or the Skinwalker Ranch, because then if someone sees something strange, they'll just say, "Oh, that's the Whaley House. It's the most haunted house in California. It must have something to do with that." And Damien, he told me if he didn't know better, he would have thought he was the victim of an alien abduction or that his house was haunted. you know, I always thought it was interesting that at UCLA, there was the Neuropsychiatric Institute, where it was one of the few active paranormal labs in America. And in Southern California, they investigated cases like the Entity case.
Yes, Barry Taft. Yep.
And who was also working at the Neuropsychiatric Institute at the same
Thelma
time?
Moss.
Well, her, yes, and also Louis Jolyon West, who was the MK Ultra scientist.
Okay, well, that just sums it up right there.
And so when you hear about in the Entity case, where the woman was claiming that she was getting raped by these invisible ghosts, and all this other stuff was happening to her, were they investigating a haunting, or were they conducting an experiment?
And I mean, there's so many, and this could be, like sometimes I think about Skinwalker Ranch, and I think, okay, this is like a LARP, I mean, it's like you're telling people, here's this place, you can't go to it, here's the gate. Oh my God, don't go past the gate because bad things are going to happen, and it's creating this, this kind of the story in your mind, and I know firsthand that you can get wrapped up in that, and then you can go to the periphery of the ranch and you can think that you're seeing things because of that kind of the suggestion that's been implanted, in your mind. And so there's so many aspects to this. Like, how do you pull a community in? How do you, it's just psychological warfare.
It's interesting that you should mention the LARP aspect of it. I mentioned in Operation Mindfuck that LARPing that goes back, in fact, into pre-ufology to the Shaver mystery, where Shaver and Ray Palmer were promulgating the stories of the underground beings who were kidnapping humans and dragging them underground and experimenting on them, and then readers would actually go out spelunking, trying to find the entrance to the to the underground world, and they would write letters and talk about what they had happened to them, and Ray Palmer would publish them, and then what they came up with would then be woven back into the ongoing Shaver mythos. And so that you could say that was one of the earliest LARPs. And also one of the guys who got involved in all that was a dude named Fred Krisman, Krisman, who later pops up in the Kennedy assassination, who was a government agent who pops up in the Shaver mystery, claiming that he's had underground battles with Deros and Teros, and also then pops up in the JFK assassination and the Maury Island affair too. That's an early example of this kind of LARPing thing, and also intelligence figures inserting themselves into the LARP.
Yeah, the whole thing is just so dirty. It's like there's not. It's amazing, but I do think, and I just want to say Rodin just made a comment. Unfortunately, between Skinwalker Ranch, the Tic Tac Navy footage, it takes up a lot of oxygen for ufology. But there are other cases happening, and of course, there are, and it is unfortunate that this kind of crap is unfortunate. I mean, this is ufology. And this is UFO Twitter. There are things like this that are being promoted, and people are not being called out about absolute fraud that is taking place. And I think that's unfortunate. And then you've got the aspect that you're talking about with Dion and some of the things that happened with him in his journey. And when was the last time that you spoke with him?
We're in contact via Facebook, and um, you know, he does not have an easy life. Let's just put it that way. Um, he's surviving. Let's just put it that way.
And is there any more information about some of the people or the organizations, characters, people in the intelligence community that were behind any of that?
Oh, it's interesting. I wrote a follow-up article called "Invisible Predators" that was in Nexus magazine in January of last year. It came out right before, right after Richard Schoengert, who's the scientist who I highlight in the book. He passed away on Christmas Eve morning of 2021, and I quote him in the article. And I was hoping to give him a copy of the article, but he passed away like a month before it was published. But that article, "Invisible Predators," is kind of a follow-up to CHAMELEO, and it's interesting. There was a guy who was interviewing me. He was going to do an article about the book about CHAMELEO for Vice, but the article was canceled for various reasons. But the guy wanted to sort of get more corroboration on the story, and so I said, "Well, look, I'll tell you the name of the NCIS agent who Dion was in contact with. You can go look her up. Call her, interview her, see what she says about this." And so he actually found her resume online, and he sent me a link, and he said, "Is this her?" And the funny thing was that he didn't read the document extensively enough, because in her resume, she it turned out that she left that she left the naval intelligence soon after the whole situation with Dion. You know, who knows why, but then she went into the private sector. So that's why this resume was online. And under her list of accomplishments, she actually mentioned retrieving the night vision goggles. she actually mentioned it in the. I said to the journalist, I go, "Did you see the 8th bullet point down under this section on the resume?" And then he wrote back. He said, "Oh, I overlooked that." So I thought that was a fascinating corroboration. There's another guy I'm in contact with in New York who's a New York talk show host on the radio. He's very popular, successful talk show host, and he claims that he's being targeted in the exact same way that Dion was, and he actually contacted Richard Schoengert, and Richard looked at all. He had video evidence. He has video evidence, which I've seen. You can actually see the operatives out in the front of his house setting up the technology to create this hologram. And Richard signed an affidavit for him before he died and said, yeah, this is absolutely the type of technology that I patented. And it was being used to target this guy, to stalk, surveil, harass him. He has tons of evidence, and unlike Dion, he actually has money to hire lawyers and things and private detectives. So he's actually suing. He's actually pursuing a lawsuit against specific individuals who he was able to pinpoint who were doing this. So that's an interesting case that's ongoing. And I've been in contact with like so many other people who have had similar situations that are ongoing. You know, and there's a guy out in Texas who lives out in the middle of nowhere. He has this complex camera set up, and he's caught all this amazing stuff on video and audio. I'm constantly in contact with other people who have had experiences or are undergoing experiences that are very similar to what Dion experienced in CHAMELEO. I mean, at some point I might actually do a book length follow-up to CHAMELEO going into some of this stuff, because it's almost it'd be a crime to just let it fall into obscurity.
Well, I have to ask you too, and thanks for letting me go over time, because I'm very interested in this. But when, I had Martin Cannon come on the show, he's been on many times, and he really dug into the abduction phenomena, whatever that was, and looked at specific technologies that we had developed over the decades and correlated that with some of the things that were taking place in the UFO world, and as a cover, and when he put that forward, that's when he left the field, because there were people that were contacting him that were potentially not stable, and he
Sure.
didn't want to be responsible for giving them, any fuel, and but then there are cases where this technology could be used, and we know that the government does strange things sometimes. And so how do you differentiate between people like that? Because it's the same thing with the UFO abduction field. I mean, it's all of this. There are a lot of gray areas.
Oh, absolutely. 80% of the people who probably contact me might fall into the latter category that Martin Cannon was was talking about. But then fortunately I had Richard Schoengert there. So I was able to say to him, "What do you think of this evidence? Does this look credible to you?" As I said, like in the case of the guy who hosts the talk show in New York, he actually wrote a legal affidavit for him, signing it, saying, yes, this passes muster. It was good to have Richard around for that purpose, because I was able to get a technical eye that I don't have, who could actually like look at the evidence and tell me, yeah, you should focus more on this rather than on this story over here. And then of course, in some cases, you talk to someone on the phone and it becomes pretty clear within 15 minutes, that there's something else going on.
Mm-hmm.
In other cases, it's less clear because the person might be purposely trying to con you, you know. And I think I've experienced those cases as well. In which case I just don't mention it.
Right.
Um, and so the ones I've have investigated more fully are those that seem credible to me for a whole variety of different reasons.
And so could you share some of those, what would make you kind of move towards the fact that they're credible, if you don't mind? And again, thank you for going over time. I really appreciate this. This
Oh
is
no, that's
important.
fine. Well, for example, in the case of the talk show host in New York, it was because he had actual video evidence, and audio and photographs, and the same with a fellow I was talking to in Texas. He had a whole array of video evidence, very strange audio as well. And there's a woman who contacted Richard. Actually, she contacted Richard, not me. I've since spoken to her at length, though, and Richard actually visited her home, and she visited him. And she also had a lot of photographic evidence, and also when the story, for example, in the case of Dion, it was very clear why it was happening to him. There was a very clear cause and effect. I mean, something happened. Dion refused to cooperate, and that's when the harassment started. In these other cases, like this woman who contacted um, Richard, she also seemed to be targeted because of her activism. She was very much an environmental activist, and it appears as if she pissed off some very powerful corporations where she was living, and that just seems to be the fulminating source in that case. Um, so that's another, if it seems to be occurring for a specific reason, there's a specific cause and effect. But of course, sometimes people are targeted for reasons that they can't fathom, and maybe they'll never know. Maybe it was random. Um, by the way, when did Martin Cannon come on your show?
Oh my gosh, she's been on probably 4 times in the past couple years.
Oh, I would like to hear those interviews.
Yeah, it was really interesting because he reached out to me, and I had read his work and watched what he had gone through in the UFO community, and like when he reached out to me, I was like, oh wow, this is amazing. And so he came on the show, and he's done several shows, and that's been very eye-opening to me because he was really concerned, and he was also, I guess, when he came out with some of these things, he was targeted, by individuals, and he felt that that was almost used by some of these people in specific areas against, it was weaponized against people.
Well, sure. I mean, he completely dropped out, right, at a certain point.
He did, yeah.
And I assume you've interviewed Adam Go Rightly, Saucers, Spooks and Kooks, and also Greg Bishop's Project Beta. Both of those books also, particularly the case of Benowitz and Richard Doty, there's parallels there as well with all the situations that you've just mentioned, and also with CHAMELEO, but also with QAnon. There are elements of QAnon that you can trace back to the disinfo that Richard Doty was feeding Paul Benowitz. So I mean that's also one reason that one should sort of take a few steps back and ask yourself if this seems credible in any way, when you can see that there are elements that Richard Doty, that the military was feeding Paul Benowitz to drive him over the edge. When you see these same elements coming back, in QAnon, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I mean, I thought someone who's actually been familiar with all this stuff needs to sit down and write some sort of analysis of it, because I didn't really see anyone else doing that. And the people who were writing about it, like early in 2020, there were articles in Atlantic and the New Yorker and Harper's where they were kind of like panic-driven essays where the journalists were really trying their hardest to wrap their mind around it, but they're well equipped to handle other aspects of it or other news stories, but I could just tell that they were not they were not up to the task of writing about this particular thing, and I think I noticed early on that Q would post links to these articles and say, you see, they're getting it wrong. The mainstream media, they don't understand this. And in fact, they were getting aspects of it wrong. So that just made it seem as if Q was telling the truth. So I take it as a sign of my success that Q would obsessively post links to all of these articles. And my 5-part series on Salon, which Salon is not quite, it's not the Washington Post, but, it's highly visible. He never linked to the 5-part series on Salon, Q. So I think that's because it just revealed too much about the about the true nature of it. So I think that, finding these elements from ufology in QAnon, even though UFOs are not, highlighted in the mythos, finding elements of Richard Schaper, finding elements of Paul Benowitz, of Greg Bishop's research in Project Beta. I think finding these elements should definitely give one pause and make one skeptical of any past, present, or future claims brought about by Q or Trump's allies.
Right, and I mean, we could say the same about Hal Puthoff and Kit Green and Jacques Vallée and some of the people that are promoting stories decade after decade and hanging out with the same people decade after decade. And Doty, who worked for Hal Puthoff and Earth Tech and things, and it's just like they've obviously made a great living doing this and promoting stuff. But at the end of the day, what have they actually put forward? Really nothing. And I mean, I know that Jacques Vallée has put out some interesting books that I've been reading for many years, but I do have to say, at the end of the day, you're hanging out with the same people and you're promoting Trinity and things. What's up with that? So it is very curious, and we need to ask questions. And I don't know. What are your closing thoughts on this, and where are you going to go next after Operation Mindfuck?
Well, I always love the. There's a quote from Robert Anton Wilson where he said he would wake up every morning and look at himself in the mirror and say, "Have I become a useful idiot yet?" Which is probably a good Zen practice to have. I don't think it's something that the QAnon people do very much, though they should. Operation Mindfuck. I'm from after this. I'm working on finishing up Hollywood Haunts the World, the book about cinema that I mentioned.
And you've got to come on my show, please, because that sounds so fascinating to me. That is so cool.
Absolutely, I would love to do that. And I have a third novel coming out called Dead Monkey Rum, which is a cryptozoological fantasy. I think is fair to describe it in that way. It revolves around the bizarre theories of Stanislaw Sukalski, who was this brilliant Polish sculptor. Netflix did a documentary about him called Struggle, The Life and Lost Art of Sukalski. It already has blurbs from Robert Williams, the painter, and Jim Woodring, also a brilliant painter who knew Sukalski. And the plot revolves around an attempt by these people to retrieve a urn that contains the ashes of Sukalski, and they want to use it for no good. And the conclusion of the novel takes place on Easter Island, which played a major role in Sukalski's bizarre theory that he developed called Zermatism. I recommend watching the documentary Struggle if you want to learn more about the peculiar artwork of the mind and peculiar theories of Stanislaw Sokolsky. So that's the subject of Dead Monkey Realm, which will probably be my next book. It should be coming out soon in 2023. And also I have a short story collection coming out called Cryptopolis and Other Stories, which will be published by Lethe Press, probably later in October. I think it's scheduled for about October of 2023, right around Halloween.
Ooh. Well, then a
Yeah.
Halloween show, you're on.
That would be great.
And that is so wonderful. And I just want to say, again, thank you. You've been so inspirational to me over the years, and I really appreciate, we've had candid conversations, especially after the whole Marx debacle, and I appreciate that. It's been an interesting ride for me, and I want to just take a minute to read what you inscribed when you sent me Operation Mindfuck. You said, to Erica Lukes, in hopes that she will continue smashing in blacked out windows and kicking down locked doors. Mahalo, Robert Guffey. And so, I just, when I got that really inspired me, and this book will always hold a special place in my heart. I appreciate the fact that you're actually looking into this and trying to shine a spotlight on this, because, like I've mentioned, there are good people who've gotten caught up in things, and it's having a detrimental effect to individuals, to families, to society, and we need to shine a spotlight on that. So thank you so much for being here, and this has been a great show.
Well, you're welcome, and I'm really glad that you're sort of rebooting and expanding your frontiers, as it were. I think it's great that the subject matter that you can cover on this show will you just have limitless potential in terms of the subject matter, which I think is fascinating.
I'm excited. I love UFOs. It's been fascinating, and I'll continue to weave that into things. In fact,
Sure.
I just want to mention, next week I'm bringing on James Carrion to talk about the ODNI report and things. But there's so many topics that deserve to be studied and talked
Sure.
about, and so this tonight has been a wonderful topic, and I appreciate it, and I look forward to having you on again. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Yes. And so thank you to everybody that listens to Expanding Frontiers. You can go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to look at our wonderful organization, to look at the work that Jack Brewer has done, and the video from Barry Greenwood. We're going to be putting together much more with regard to this. You can make a tax deductible donation to Expanding Frontiers Research. You can also go to UFOclassified.com and pledge to the show. I appreciate all of you guys. You are wonderful. I look forward to being here next week. You guys stay safe. Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Peter, for everything. And I will catch you guys next week.